Evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Bible study. We are coming to you by this video because of the weather. We've got storms moving through our area. Our elders felt that we would be safer doing it this way. We're thankful for their wisdom, and so that's why we're coming to you by way of this video. Tonight, we are going to be making a study of the prophet Habakkuk. If I were to ask how many of you have read Habakkuk, he's probably not one of the prophets that we have spent a great deal of time with. Yet Habakkuk is probably one of those that we can relate to the most because of what he was concerned about. Though the book doesn't read like many of the prophets, yet it's very, very important. And so let's look and explore some of the things about Habakkuk. We know that his name means embrace, okay? And certainly he was embracing the love and the rules and the association with God, though he didn't understand what the reasoning behind God's philosophy. And so the book is going to be exploring that, and we'll be dealing with that a little bit later. The date of Habakkuk is about the year 607. This would be on the eve of the Babylonian exile. We know that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came against Judah in 3 different waves, and this began in about the year of 606, 605 BC. So Habakkuk was written just prior to this. He is the prophet, which is the author. He's the prophet of faith. He's going to explore the idea of faith and our faith in God and how God can do some of the things that he does. It's interesting because most of the prophets prophesied from a place, a physical location, whether it be Jerusalem, whether it be in the land of captivity, whether it be in north or south, or in the case of Daniel and Ezekiel in the prophets in the land of Babylon, wherever it may be, but not with Habakkuk. The place that Habakkuk was concerned with was his heart. And his heart was what he was imploring God. Help me to understand. And so we will see that there is a great number of things that Habakkuk raised questions about. Now, concerning some of the background information, Habakkuk the prophet is all that we know about this great man of God. There's nothing more said than that. We have a little bit of secular history, but very little about the man itself. Some have theorized, now this is just what some people have said, some have theorized that he may have been a Levite temple musician. And this is primarily based on Habakkuk 3 and verse number 19. And let me read that to you. It says, "The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high hills to the chief musician with my stringed instruments. And so some have theorized that he may have been a temple musician based upon this very passage to the choir master as the chief musician. Now that may be the case. We don't know that. I'm just tossing that out as an idea that this may be what we know more about the man Habakkuk. Rabbinic tradition, this is that which has come down from the rabbis. Their tradition says that he was the son of the Shunammite woman over in 2 Kings 4, 8 through 37 that we read about there. And this great Shunammite woman and her great faith as it was concerned. And so it very well could have been that this is the case. Can we prove that? No, and that's why we're being cautious not to say that it was or that it was not, because I simply do not know. There's not enough evidence to base that statement upon. Okay, So, the home of the prophet is unknown. The context of the book seems to lead one to conclude that it was in Jerusalem, because this was on the eve of the Babylonian captivity. So God's people, as far as Judah is concerned, they're still in the land. Israel, of course, has been deposed into the Assyrian captivity, and there were 3 waves there, but that was nearly, well over 120 years earlier than this. And so we conclude that it was no doubt from the city of Jerusalem. As to the date, it must have been before the Babylonian Empire, because that captivity began in about the year 606 BC. And so that's why we're backing it up a year earlier, back in about the year of 607. Surely you'll give me a little leeway there, being none of us go back to that exact date, and that's all that we're suggesting, that these are approximate times. Now, Habakkuk doesn't read like any of the other books of prophecy. We've talked about Joel and Amos and Hosea and Obadiah and Jonah and Micah and Zephaniah and Nahum. And all of these, that was a prophecy against a particular nation or against a particular people. But Habakkuk is not like that. Habakkuk is really the man questioning God and said, God, I don't understand how it is that you can use people that are far more wicked than your people to discipline them. Well, when we think about that, logically it makes sense, doesn't it? God knows that those people are going to suffer great vengeance, and so He uses them that they can teach God's people the reality of their consequences. And so they're going to receive the punishment, but they also can teach God's people not to sin. There's another example we have of this over in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we have, or chapter 5 rather, we have a problem that there was in the church at Corinth, a man who was with his stepmother. No doubt his father's wife, but it seems to have been a different marriage. And he was lying with her. And as a result of that, Paul was writing to the church and said, you are puffed up with this. You should rather be mourning because you're tolerating sin. Okay? And so you ought to pray that this one soul might be delivered unto Satan. Why? That he may teach him not to blaspheme, not to profane that which is holy. Satan has a way of teaching us. He can teach us how evil really is. Well, just as God used Satan in that case, God is using Babylon in this case of the prophet that we're studying about. So that's a little bit of the why. We'll get more into detail when we actually look at some of the problems that Habakkuk has raised. Now, Habakkuk seems to be taking his perplexities unto Jehovah for answers. And of course, isn't that where we all should go? If we have a Bible question, friends, I'm glad that we have those that we have confidence in, that we can go to them. But remember this, all men have feet of clay. And where we ought to go first of all is go to God's book. Let's see if we can't find the answer to God's book there. And then if we can't, then let's begin to search and see if others may be able to help us. And so that's what Habakkuk was designed to do. He was wanting to go to Jehovah and to find out real answers to some of the questions. Now, friends, these questions were really perplexed, and they were bothering Habakkuk to no end. Now, the prophet of God was seeking answers, but not only for himself. He had questions about this, but he seems to be doing this for all of his fellow countrymen, for all of those that were in Judah just prior to, but they know the captivity is coming. It's already been prophesied. It's already been determined because of Israel's refusal to obey that which is of God, that they're going to go into captivity. Now, could it be avoided? Indeed. But how could it be avoided? The only way that this could be avoided would be Judah stopping what she's doing, stop going a-whoring after all of the other gods, stop her idolatry, and return unto Jehovah, and do His will, and be sincere about it. Whenever we make that decision that I'm no longer going to follow the dictates of what someone else says, of what my own feelings and thinkings are, when I want to go back to the Bible and do what the Bible says, I can avoid a lot of the pain and the suffering and a lot of the mistakes that people suffer from. We can avoid those simply through our gospel obedience. The same was true with Judah. And so Judah had questions for himself, but these questions were deeper as well, as his fellow countrymen were concerned about. Now, let's look at an analysis of the book here. And as we consider what is being said, we realize that God's judgment upon Judah, the wicked people of God, is going to be through the hands of the Chaldeans. Now, these Chaldeans are those from Babylon. That's the nation that we're speaking about, okay? And so, excuse me, when we look at Habakkuk 1, beginning with about verse number 2, notice what he says here. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you, violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention as it is arises. Therefore, the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, perverse judgment proceeds. And so here he is at the hand of the Chaldeans. And through these wicked hands, we recognize the fact that they are going to punish the people of God. Now, I want to reserve some other comments about this in more depth in just a moment as we begin to look at the chapters. But here is God's judgment now going to be poured out upon Judah. Let's stop and think for a moment. In about the year 722, 721 BC, God's judgment had been poured out against Israel, the 10 northern tribes. And this through the hands of Tiglath-Pileser, otherwise known as Pul, the king of the ancient Assyrian Empire, Nineveh being the capital. As a result, there were 3 carryings away of Israel into captivity. And so Israel is gone. She's been deposed, okay? Now, because Judah has followed in the footsteps of her wicked brothers and sisters, that of Israel, God is now going to be punishing her as well. And so we look on. The first perplexity that Habakkuk really has in his heart, something that really disturbs him and bothers him, is found here in chapter 1, verses 2 through 11. Let's read this together, and let's see what it is that he's concerned about. I mentioned to you how long, O Lord, shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? And plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention as it arises. Therefore the law is powerless, the justice never goes forth, and the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, perverse judgments proceed. Notice this. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astonished. For I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told you. For indeed, I am raising up the Chaldeans. Now listen to this. I'm raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. And the terrible and the dreadful, their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses are also swifter than leopards, the more fleeced than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. In the count of violence, the count for violence, their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captivity and sand. They scoff at kings. The princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, and they heap upon heathen mounds and seize it. Then his mind changes and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. And so Habakkuk says, God, this is perplexing to me. Now, why is this? Number one, he says, how can you, Jehovah, the great God of this universe, the master of all things, how can you justify using an indifference with this presence of this wickedness and this violence that is characteristic of the Babylonians? How can you use that against your own people? And Habakkuk was like throwing up his hands. He said, I don't understand. Well, it was very perplexing. And if one does not know somewhat about the nature of God and the nature of things, we might be still wondering why today ourselves. But I want you to notice some things. God gives Habakkuk an answer. First of all, here's what he replies. He says, he is not indifferent. That is, that he will raise up the Chaldeans to do what? To execute his judgment. Remember, as we read verses 5 through 11, what all he was going to do. They were known for their violence and for their iniquity. And God says, I'm well aware of that. And he says, I'm going to be using that, or allow the Babylonians to use that against my people. Why? Because they can teach my people some things that I haven't been able to get across. I have sent to them prophets. They've refused. They've not obeyed the prophets. Sometimes they have to see just how bad things really are. And I wonder if that's why the earth is continuing as it is today. When you and I look around us, we see gross immorality. We see wickedness. You cannot look at the morning newspaper. You cannot look at the morning news. Everything is just filled with all kinds of filth and iniquity that's being perpetrated upon people today. And it seems like that the tomorrow's headlines are even going to be worse than what we're reading about today. Well, God says, I've got a cure for this. There's going to be those that are going to be able to execute judgment, and they're going to be able to teach my people some things that are very, very important. Now, I want you to notice two things that he's going to draw upon. First of all, notice this. He says, their rise is from me, Jehovah. Verses 7 through 11. I am the one that is allowing them to do this. But notice the second aspect of this. He says, let me go back to that. Their character is of themselves. I raised them up. I'm going to allow them and permit them to go into the land and to perpetrate whatever it is that they're going to do. But he says their character is of themselves. Now, let's pause there for just a moment. Because isn't that true with us today? Who is responsible for my character? Who's responsible for your character? Are not we, as our own individuals, responsible for ourselves? I remember reading a passage over in Ezekiel chapter 18, chapter 20, I believe it is, rather, where it says, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. The Son shall not bear the iniquity of the Father, neither shall the Father bear the iniquity of the Son. For the righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. In essence, what Ezekiel is saying, and that's Ezekiel 18:20, Ezekiel is saying that the Son doesn't bear the iniquity of the Father. The Father bears that. And neither does the Father bear the iniquity that the Son does. The Son must bear that. Each one of us must bear the deeds done in our own body. But friends, that's not only true just because the Old Testament said it, but turn to Paul in his teaching of 2 Corinthians 5. He says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Why, Paul? To receive the things done in the body, according as he hath done, whether it be good or whether it be bad. Whether it be good unto righteousness, or evil or bad unto iniquity. That's what we're going to receive. It's not what my children, my grandchildren, or what my dad or my grandfather did, but what I do and what I choose. Now, returning to our text, God is emphasizing to Habakkuk. He said, Habakkuk, I understand your concern. And he said, it's valid. But he said, let me talk to you about this. He said, I'm only going to allow the Babylonians, or the Chaldeans in this case, to come against my people because they can teach them some things. And what is it they're going to teach them? Just how bad sin really is. Now, friends, listen to me carefully. I'm not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet. But the same is true with us today. We will not make the changes that are necessary in our life until we see what that sin does to God and how God is offended. And because God being offended, what is going to be perpetrated upon us as thy people? Now, Judah was still the chosen people, part of the chosen people of God. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to go unpunished because of their wickedness and their immorality. So Habakkuk needed to understand that this was the very thing that was going to be taking place. Now look with me, if you will, again, as we come back and we see the second perplexity that Habakkuk is concerned with. This second perplexity is found in chapters 1, verse 12, through chapter 2, verse 3. Let me begin reading. The prophet's second question. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. The Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. Rock, you have them marked for correction. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously as they do? He says, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours. A person more righteous than he? Why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? He says, they take up all of them with a hook. They catch them in their net and gather them in their dragnet. Therefore, they rejoice and are glad. Therefore, they sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their dragnet, because by them their share is sumptuous and their food plentiful. Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrupt. And so here he says, God, here's the second problem that I'm really struggling with. And I'm really needing answers. And what is it? He says, how long, O God, you holy, you're the righteous one, how long can a holy God employ an impure and a godless agent to do his work? Habakkuk was struggling with that. He said, they seem to be as though they're at your disposal. Well, he was correct in that assumption, because they were. Remember, God said that he had raised them up. He was going to accomplish something with them. Now, I remember reading over in the book of Revelation that there was a cry in chapter 6 of those souls that were under the altar. And they were crying out unto God, how long, O Lord God, holy and true, will it be before you avenge our blood at the hands of those who shed it? Well, friends, one thing that we must keep in mind, and this is important, and actually you can find it all the way through the pages of inspiration, and that is this: God is never bound to our time frame. God is not duty bound to do something in the time frame in which I think it ought to be done. In fact, in today's society, when I pray to God about this or about that, first thing you know, I begin to look, has God answered this yet? And I think that God ought to answer, God ought to satisfy my curiosity. Well, God's not a God to do that. God says in his own due time, he will answer that. He will take care of it, okay? But it's not according to our own time frame. And so here he's going to allow them to do what they're going to do, because evidently God says they have been steeped enough in this that when they go into captivity, we understand captivity is going to be 70 years. That generation is going to die out in the land of captivity, and it will be their seed after them that will come back from captivity. So we understand that these things were going to take place. So what does God say? Here is Jehovah's response. He says, the judgment is sure, okay? It's going to happen as I proclaim that it's going to happen. But he says it's not going to be immediate. It's not going to be the way that you want it to be. It will be when I determine, okay? And this is found chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Notice that again, as he makes mention. He says, "Then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but as the end it shall speak, and it shall not lie." In other words, God says this is not going to be something that's going to take place just any time in the immediate few hours. Well, friends, I wish we had more time, but time has caught us, and we're going to have to end here. But next week, we're going to pick up with this because we want to see more of how Habakkuk rationalizes and reasons through these things. And friends, this is so relevant to our society today. But thank you so much for being with us, and I look forward to seeing you next week in person as we continue this study. Thank you, and good night.